The tray hit the rinkside table first, then the sketchbook, then a cardboard cup of hot chocolate that burst across the rubber matting and steamed in the cold arena air. Willa Cormier didn't move. Her hands stayed flat on the table, fingers spread, the way a person braces when they've learned that flinching only makes it worse. I said, "Pick it up." Tanner Ashford stood over her. Three of his friends fanned out behind him, one already holding up a phone. "You hard of hearing? Or is that just how they raise you where you come from?" A few steps away, near the boot rack by the double doors, Solomon Adeyemi tightened his grip on the handle of his floor squeegee until the plastic creaked. He was 53 years old, and he had spent 4 winters keeping the Amberley Community Complex warm, dry, and salted, and in all that time he had learned that the smartest thing a man in a gray coverall could do was keep his eyes on the floor and his opinions to himself. But the girl at the table had eyes like his daughter's after a bad day at school, red at the rims and dry on purpose, because crying in front of them was a thing you only did once. Solomon set the squeegee against the wall. He walked over, unhurried, and stopped between the boy and the table. "That's enough," he said. "Quiet. Even." Tanner turned, looked him up and down, and laughed like he'd been handed a gift. "Mind the floors, janitor. That's what they pay you the big bucks for." Solomon didn't move. Not an inch. And he had no idea, standing there with slush soaking into the cuffs of his pants, that the trembling girl behind him had a father the whole town crossed the street to avoid. A man who was about to walk into a locked boardroom and turn every quiet cruelty in that building inside out. Before the lawyers, before the recovered footage, before the morning a photograph would matter more than a chain of car dealerships, there was only a man, a mop, and a decision that would cost him everything he had. Solomon Adeyemi punched in at the wreck every morning at 5:45. He drove a rust-bellied Corolla with 280,000 kilometers on it and parked it in the far corner of the lot, under the light standard that had been dead since the fall before last. Because that was the one spot nobody else wanted. He carried a thermos of black coffee and a lunch bag that always held the same thing, and he let himself in through the loading door before the front desk staff had even shaken the snow off their boots. He salted the entrances. He squeegeed the lobby. He wiped down the bleachers, emptied the bins, and scrubbed change room floors that grown men left in a state they would never tolerate in their own homes. He did it 6 days a week, and he did it without complaint, because every hour of it went somewhere that mattered. Her name was Ada. She was 9 years old, in grade 4, and she was the reason his heart still worked. Every morning before the sun came up over Fort Amberley, Solomon stood in the narrow kitchen of their apartment above the laundromat on Birch Street and made her the same breakfast: an egg, a slice of toast cut on the diagonal, half a banana, and on the little whiteboard stuck to the fridge, he wrote one word. Just one. That was the game. Ada had to use the word in a real sentence by supper time, or she owed him a joke. Some mornings the word was resilient. Some mornings it was stubborn, which always made her grin, because she knew exactly who he meant. She kept a spiral notebook of all of them under her pillow, 206 words and counting. Their place was small, one bedroom that he'd given to her, a pull-out couch that was his, walls thin enough to hear the dryers thumping below until midnight. But he kept it spotless. Ada's drawings went up on the wall with painter's tape, pressed flat at the corners so they wouldn't peel the paint, because he wasn't about to lose the damage deposit over a thumbtack. He walked her to school every morning and held her mittened hand at the crosswalk on Front Street, even though she'd started telling him she was too old for that. He watched her disappear through the doors, and only then did his shoulders come down from around his ears. His wife, Ngozi, had been gone 3 years. It started as a cough she blamed on the dry Ontario winters, and by the time anyone took it seriously, the cancer had already made itself at home in both lungs. 4 months. That was the whole of it. She was 39. After the funeral, the church ladies brought casseroles and told him he was strong, and told him Ada was blessed to have him, and told him that time was a great healer. Not one of them phoned after the second month. Solomon learned single fatherhood the way he'd learned everything else in this country. Alone, at night, with a phone propped against the sugar tin. He learned to braid hair from a woman at the coin laundry, who took pity on him. He learned that a bedtime story mattered more than a spotless sink, and that a child who felt safe at night would grow into a woman who didn't have to make herself small in the daytime. There was one thing Ada wanted that he could not seem to reach. Hockey. Real hockey on a real team, with a real jersey that had her name ironed on the back. She'd stood at the glass one Saturday and watched the U11 girls tear up the ice, and she hadn't said a word for a long time, and then she'd said, "Dad, when they skate fast, it feels like it's happening inside my chest." He'd gone home and looked at the numbers. Registration was $340. Then the equipment. Then the tournament fees, the away weekends, the tape and the sticks that snapped like they were made of candy. He'd opened the banking app on his phone and looked at the balance and closed it, and lain awake staring at the water stain on the ceiling until 2 in the morning. The next week he took a second job stocking shelves at the Foodland on Tuesday and Thursday nights, 9 to midnight, and slept 4 hours after. Ada never knew. At the rec, Solomon kept his head down. He said good morning to people who didn't say it back. He held the heavy door for parents wrestling hockey bags, who walked through like he was part of the frame. Warren Pruitt, the facility manager, liked him for exactly that. Pruitt called Solomon reliable. Said it the way you'd describe a furnace that didn't act up. Solomon heard the shape of it and swallowed it and kept mopping. Because every night he came home to a little girl who believed, without a shred of doubt, that her father could fix anything in the world. And as long as she believed that, nothing anybody at that arena said could reach him. Until the Tuesday he noticed the girl in the corner of the warm-up lounge who sat like she was apologizing to the room for existing. Willa Cormier was 17. She'd shown up 3 days running and taken the same seat each time. The far table by the vending machines, back to the wall, hood up, a sketchbook open in front of her and a stub of pencil moving across the page. She never bought anything. She just sat where it was warm and drew. Turning pages like the paper was the only place in Fort Amberley that hadn't already made up its mind about her. She'd come to town 6 weeks earlier, after her mother died. Breast cancer. Willa had been the one holding her hand in the palliative wing at Meridian General when the monitors went flat. She'd been 16 then. Now she lived with her grandmother, Estelle, in a little house out on the Selby Road with a wood stove and a yard full of snow-buried scrap, and she'd arrived with a duffel bag and a shoebox of pencils and nothing else. Her father was Gideon Cormier. He ran Cormier Salvage and Demolition out on the highway, and he rode with the North Bay chapter of a writers' association, and around Fort Amberley his name was a kind of weather warning. People locked their trucks when his crew rolled through. The rumor was simple, and it traveled faster than any truth. Gideon Cormier was dangerous, his people were criminals, and anyone who carried that name carried trouble. Willa never told a soul at the wreck who her father was. She didn't have to. Someone recognized the patch on the leather jacket she wore the first week. Her mother's jacket, the one that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and her mother's hand cream. And by that afternoon the whispering had started. By Friday, the girl behind the canteen counter had stopped meeting her eyes. The Rink attendant walked past her table 4 times in an hour without a nod. Solomon watched from across the lobby, pushing his squeegee in slow arcs. He saw how tightly her fingers gripped the pencil. He saw the way her shoulders climbed when a group of teenagers came in loud through the front doors. He knew that posture, the curved spine, the tucked chin, the whole body arranged around the hope of not being seen. Ada had sat like that once. The winter, a boy in her class told her that her mother died because God didn't want their family to be too happy. Solomon held his daughter until she fell asleep that night, and he'd made himself a promise in the dark. No child should ever have to fold themselves in half just to get through an ordinary afternoon. He didn't go to her. Not yet. Then Tanner Ashford came in on a Thursday with 3 of his buddies and a grin that existed for the sole purpose of shrinking other people. His father, Gregory Ashford, owned the biggest car dealership between Amberley and Sudbury and had written a fat check toward the complex's new therapy pool. And that money had bought his son a kind of immunity everyone understood without a word being said. Tanner walked straight to Willa's table. "Hey, biker girl." She kept her eyes on the page. "I'm talking to you." He dropped into the chair across from her, and his friends closed a loose ring around the table. One took out a phone. "My old man says your old man runs a gang. That true? You got a gang?" "No. Barely a breath." "Speak up. What's wrong with you?" "Nothing." A whisper. "So what's he do then? Cook meth? Break legs? Which is it?" Willa closed the sketchbook. Her hands were shaking. Solomon stood 4 meters off, and the tendons in his forearm stood up like cable under the coverall. Every instinct in his body leaned forward, and every memory of Ada saying, "Don't get in trouble, Dad, please. We can't lose the job," held him fast to the floor. He looked toward the manager's office. Through the glass, Warren Pruitt sat at his desk, and he was watching. 4 teenagers boxing in one girl. A phone recording. Trembling hands. Pruitt glanced down at his monitor and went back to typing. Tanner stood, knocked the sketchbook off the table, and walked away laughing, his friends trailing and slapping his shoulder. Willa knelt, gathered the pages that had come loose, and smoothed them against her knee. Her eyes were red, but she didn't cry, not until they were gone through the doors. Then she pressed her forehead to the cold table, and her shoulders shook without a sound. Solomon turned away because his own eyes were burning, and that night he didn't sleep either. The next morning he clocked in 11 minutes early. He told himself it was to get ahead of the change rooms before the 8 o'clock crowd. His mop went straight to the warm-up lounge. Willa was already there. Same table, same hood, sketchbook open, but today the pencil wasn't moving. At the canteen, he bought a cup of hot chocolate with his own loonies and set it down at the edge of her table without a word, then turned to go. "Wait." He stopped. "Why?" "You looked cold. Nobody bothers." She said it like a fact she'd stopped resenting. "Nobody comes over here." Solomon looked at her, 17 years old, speaking like kindness was a thing that happened to other people's children. "Well," he said, "I'm somebody." He went back to mopping. That was all of it. No speech, no lecture. A paper cup and 5 seconds of a stranger looking at her like she was worth the walk across the room. But Willa wrapped both hands around the cup and held it like it weighed something. The next day she said good morning. He said it back. The day after, she asked his name. He told her. She told him hers and watched his face when she said the surname, the way she'd learned to watch. His expression didn't change at all. By the end of the week, they had a rhythm. Solomon passed the lounge around 8:30, after the pool deck was squeegeed, and sometimes he stopped for a minute. Willa started talking in small pieces. Her grandmother's house was quiet and smelled like wood smoke and cinnamon buns. Drawing was the one thing that didn't ask her to explain herself. She turned the sketchbook toward him one morning. Pencil portraits, careful and true. A woman with laugh lines and tired eyes. Her mother. A row of half-stripped cars behind a chain-link fence, drawn from memory. A single chickadee on a bare branch. Solomon put his finger near the bird. "That one. Why? Looks like it hasn't decided yet whether to stay or fly off." She smiled. Quick and gone, like something out of practice. He told her about Ada, how she talked in her sleep, how she wanted to play hockey more than she wanted anything, how she drew too, mostly stick people with enormous heads and hands like rakes. Willa laughed, a real one, short, surprising even her. "I could draw her," she said. "If you tell me what she looks like. Big eyes. Front tooth she just lost. Braids, always braids, or she cries." The next day, Willa handed him a folded sheet. Inside was a little girl, with braids and a gap in her grin, drawn so faithfully his breath caught. Solomon folded it once, carefully, and slid it into his chest pocket, over his heart. But warmth like that draws frost in a town like Fort Amberley. Word went around the wreck, not about the man who was kind to a lonely kid, but about the girl's last name. The canteen girl told the skate sharpening guy. The skate sharpening guy told the woman at the front desk. By Wednesday, everyone knew the quiet girl in the corner was Gideon Cormier's daughter, and people didn't just avoid Willa now. They avoided Solomon too. The evening custodian stopped splitting a thermos with him at shift change. A hockey mom near the pro shop leaned to her friend as he passed and said, "Loud enough. He's been hanging around that biker girl. Wouldn't surprise me if there's something going on there." Solomon heard it. He kept walking. He kept mopping. And the next morning he bought another hot chocolate. There was a moment in between that mattered more than anyone standing in that lobby understood at the time. It was a Saturday, mid-morning, the place packed for minor hockey, and an old man in a Canadian's toque stood up from the bleachers, took 2 steps, and went down like a dropped coat. His grandson screamed. People froze the way crowds freeze. Solomon dropped his squeegee and crossed the floor before anyone else had risen from their seat. He was on his knees beside the man in 3 seconds. 2 fingers to the throat, ear to the mouth, the whole assessment done in the time it took the front desk girl to find the phone. He tipped the head, cleared the airway, laced his hands, and started compressions, steady, deep, counting under his breath in a language nobody around him spoke. He worked like a man who had done this 1,000 times, because he had. A nurse who happened to be there for her son's practice knelt across from him and reached to take over, and then stopped watching his hands and simply said, "Tell me what you need." Solomon told her clearly, in the calm, flat voice of someone who had run codes on the worst nights of his life. When the paramedics came through the doors, the old man had a pulse, and one of them looked up at the janitor in the gray coverall and asked who'd started CPR, and Solomon had already stepped back to pick up his squeegee. Warren Pruitt watched that too from his office window and filed it away as a liability he'd rather not have to write up. It broke on a Monday. Gregory Ashford phoned Warren Pruitt's direct line at 9:08 in the morning, and the call lasted 11 minutes, and Solomon would never hear a word of it, but its weight would land on him before lunch. Ashford was not a man who raised his voice. He'd never had to. His son had come home the week before with a version of events that bore no resemblance to anything that happened, a story in which a janitor had grabbed his arm, shouted him down, and embarrassed him in front of everyone, all because Tanner had politely asked a girl to move her bag off an empty chair. Gregory believed every syllable. Fathers like Gregory always did. "I want him gone," he told Pruitt, "today." Pruitt didn't hesitate. At 1:45, Solomon was called to the manager's office. He'd never been inside it. The carpet was blue, the desk was too big for the room, and a framed photo of Pruitt shaking hands with the mayor sat on the shelf. It smelled of cologne and plug-in air freshener, that particular combination of a room where problems get covered rather than fixed. Pruitt didn't offer a chair. "This won't take long. We've had a complaint. Multiple witnesses say you verbally threatened and physically intimidated a group of young patrons in the warm-up lounge. That is not what happened." "I have statements." "From who?" Pruitt opened a folder. 3 printed pages. Solomon could see the signatures, the same tidy slant on all of them. Tanner's friends. "And frankly," Pruitt went on, "this isn't the first concern. You've been spending shift time socializing with a member of the public instead of doing your job. That alone's a write-up. I took my break at her table. That is permitted. Not when the person's presence has been flagged as disruptive. She sits there because of who her family is. You associating with her reflects poorly on this facility." Pruitt leaned back. "I think we both understand how it looks." Solomon held very still. "How what looks?" Pruitt's eyes traveled once, over the coverall, over his hands, over his face, and he did not say the word. He didn't have to. It sat in the room between them, silent and enormous and perfectly understood. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Leave your keys and your fob at the front desk. Your final pay will be direct deposited. The cameras, Solomon said. There are cameras in that lounge. Check them. They will show exactly what happened. Something crossed Pruitt's face. Not guilt, only calculation. There was a technical fault with the recording system last week. That footage isn't recoverable. Solomon's hands hung at his sides. He did not shout. He had lived in enough rooms with closed doors and no witnesses to know precisely what happened to men who looked like him when they raised their voices. I understand, he said. He didn't, but the words came out anyway, because sometimes survival speaks a language that dignity cannot afford. He handed over his keys. He walked out through the loading door for the last time, past the mop bucket he'd filled that morning, past the lounge where the corner table sat empty. She was waiting for him in the parking lot, arms wrapped around herself, breath fogging, eyes swollen. I heard, she said. Solomon, I'm so sorry. This is because of me. No, it is, if I hadn't. Willa. He stopped and made her look at him. This is not yours to carry. Do you hear me? Don't you dare pick that up. She nodded, but her face said she'd carry it anyway. Solomon sat in the Corolla in the lot outside the laundromat for a long time, with the engine off and the windows fogging, and he did the arithmetic. Rent was due in 11 days, $890. He had $430 in the account. The Foodland shifts brought in $240 every 2 weeks. That left him short before hydro, before groceries, before the winter tires the Corolla badly needed. He could sell the guitar he never played anymore. He could ask the landlord for a week. He could skip lunches. He'd done it before, and Ada had never known. He pressed his forehead to the wheel. His phone buzzed. A message from the school. Reminder, skating field trip Friday. $12, exact change if possible. $12 for a bus and a rented pair of skates. For a trip his daughter had talked about all week. Solomon closed his eyes, and his thumb hovered, and then he typed back, she'll be there. He didn't know how, but she would be there. That night, after Ada was asleep with her word notebook under the pillow, he sat at the kitchen table and looked at the drawing Willa had made of his daughter, and the penciled eyes looked back at him, full of a faith he was terrified of failing. Across town, on the Selby Road, Willa Cormier was doing the one thing she'd been most afraid to do for 6 weeks. She was calling her father. It rang 3 times. She nearly hung up on the second. Willa? Gideon Cormier's voice was low and rough gravel over something warm. Surprised first, then careful, the way he always sounded with her, like a man holding something he was scared to grip too hard. Hi, Dad. You okay? Is your grandmother okay? We're fine. It's not about us. And then it all came out. The lounge, Tanner, the shoving, the man with the mop who'd stepped between her and 4 boys twice his size and hadn't so much as blinked. The firing, the wiped cameras, the name Pruitt, the name Ashford. Gideon listened without a word. She could hear him breathing slow and measured, the way he breathed when he was keeping something down deep. When she finished, the line was quiet for a long moment. What's his name? Gideon said. The one they fired. Solomon Dayami, and the manager, Warren Pruitt. Okay, a breath. Give me 2 days. Gideon Cormier was not the man Fort Amberley thought he was. Cormier Salvage employed 19 people, most of them men who'd done time and couldn't get hired anywhere else, and Gideon paid them a living wage and drug-tested them Mondays and fired no one who stayed clean. He'd started a small fund after his wife died, the Colleen Cormier Memorial, named for the woman he'd buried, that quietly covered registration and equipment for kids in the district whose parents couldn't afford minor sports. The paperwork listed him only as G. Cormier, benefactor. He didn't want his name on it. He wanted the ice paid for. He hung up with his daughter and made 2 calls. The first was to a labor lawyer in Sudbury he'd used before, a woman named Delphine Roux, who had a voice like a scalpel and a habit of winning. The second was to a fellow he knew who did digital recovery, the kind who understood that when a small facility loses its footage, the cloud backup on the off-site server almost always survives for 30 days, because nobody at the front desk ever cancels the subscription. The report came back inside 2 days, and it was thick. Warren Pruitt had run the Amberley complex for 6 years. In that time, 9 casual and part-time staff had been let go. 6 of them were newcomers or people of color. 4 had filed complaints with the Ministry of Labor. All 4 had been settled quietly. Small checks, non-disclosure agreements, silence bought at a discount out of the facility's operating budget, which was topped up every year by donors. Gregory Ashford's name appeared in Pruitt's email 11 times in a single year. One message, sent the morning Solomon was fired, read, "Deal with the janitor today. Tanner's upset, and I don't want this turning into a thing." Pruitt's reply, 7 minutes later, handled. And the footage was there. Every frame. The cloud backup showed the lounge exactly as it had happened. The 4 boys ringing the table, the sketchbook knocked to the floor, the photograph, the shove, and one custodian stepping in with nothing but his voice and his spine. It also showed Warren Pruitt at his office window, watching the whole thing and doing nothing. There was one more thing in the file buried in a routine background check that Delphine Roux had ordered as a matter of course. Solomon Adeyemi, before he emigrated, had been a consultant cardiothoracic surgeon at a teaching hospital in Lagos for 19 years. His credentials had never been recognized in Ontario. He had been mopping a hockey arena because the fastest road back to the operating theater would have cost him more money and more years than a single father, with a 9-year-old could spare, and Ada needed to eat now. Gideon read that page twice. Then he set the folder down and made a third call to the office of Josephine Marsh, chair of the complex's foundation board, and requested 5 minutes at Thursday's meeting. He was told it was a closed session. He said he'd be brief. The board met Thursday morning in the second-floor room above the pro shop. 7 members, Warren Pruitt and Gregory Ashford, attending as an advisory donor. Coffee come in white mugs. A printed agenda nobody would follow. Solomon Adeyemi wasn't invited. He found out from Willa, who texted him at 8. "My dad's coming. Please be there." Upstairs, 10 o'clock. He almost didn't go. He had a job interview at a warehouse in Sudbury at 1, and he was already in his one good shirt, the one he'd pressed at 5 that morning while Ada ate her cereal and asked why he was dressed up. "Meeting," he'd said. "About a job? Maybe." He drove to the wreck and parked in his old spot under the dead light. He walked in through the front doors for the first time in 4 years. Not the loading dock, not the service hallway. The front doors, glass and chrome and gray November light, and took the stairs and sat in the last chair against the back wall of the boardroom. Nobody acknowledged him. Pruitt glanced up, saw him, and looked away like a man who'd already finished a conversation he never meant to have. Gregory Ashford sat near the window in a good suit and a golfer's tan, scrolling his phone. Josephine Marsh called the meeting to order and read the first item, resurfacing the outdoor rink pad. She got no further because the door opened and Gideon Cormier walked in. He wore a black leather jacket over a clean white shirt, and his boots were polished, and his beard was trimmed close. Behind him came 3 people in dark suits carrying matching cases. They moved like people who had done this before and didn't mind the work. The room went quiet the way a room goes quiet when the floor tilts. "I'm sorry," Josephine said. "This is a closed session." Gideon pulled a chair from the wall and sat down at the head of the table, not beside it, at it, and his lawyers flanked him and opened their cases. "My name is Gideon Cormier. My daughter is Willa Cormier. She's been harassed in this building for 6 weeks. Your manager watched it happen, did nothing, and then fired the one man who stood up for her. I'm here to show you what that looks like on paper." Pruitt's face went the color of dishwater. Gregory Ashford set his phone down. Delphine Roux stood and walked a bound document to each board member, 31 pages, tabbed and color printed. Tab 3, security footage recovered from the off-site cloud backup, time-stamped and unedited. You'll see 4 young men surround a 17-year-old girl. You'll see them destroy her property and record it on a phone. And you'll see Mr. Pruitt observing from his office for the full duration. She paused. He did not intervene. Tab 6. The termination file for Mr. Solomon Adeyemi. Grounds cited. Harassment of patrons. The 3 witness statements were signed by 3 of the 4 aggressors visible in that footage. They were fabricated. The second lawyer took over, tall, with reading glasses on a chain. Tab 9. Email correspondence between Mr. Gregory Ashford and Mr. Warren Pruitt on the morning. Mr. Adeyemi was fired. I'll read the relevant line. Deal with the janitor today. Tanner's upset and I don't want this turning into a thing. He looked up. Mr. Ashford, would you care to clarify what deal with meant here? Gregory opened his mouth. His own lawyer behind him leaned in and murmured something. Gregory shut it and said nothing. The third lawyer, the youngest, had the thickest folder. Tab 14. A pattern analysis of terminations under Mr. Pruitt's management over 6 years, 9 dismissed, 6 were newcomers or racialized workers, 4 filed complaints. All 4 were settled with non-disclosure agreements funded out of this facility's operating budget, which is to say, out of your donor's money. Your donors paid to keep this quiet. Josephine Marsh took off her glasses and set them on the table. Warren? Pruitt straightened his tie. This is completely out of context. The terminations were performance-based. Mr. Adeyemi violated conduct policy. The camera fault was a technical. The cameras were not faulty, Delphine Roux said. The local storage was wiped by hand. The access log shows it was done from the terminal in your office at 4:17 in the afternoon, on the day Mr. Adeyemi was fired, 41 minutes after you fired him. Pruitt's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. Gideon hadn't spoken since his opening. He'd sat with his hands folded, watching. When the silence in the room reached the point where everyone knows the ending, and no one said it out loud, he stood. I'm not here to make a speech, he said. I run a salvage yard. I take things apart, and I know when something's too far gone to save. He looked at Pruitt. You watched a group of boys shove my daughter, and you sat at your desk and typed. Then you fired the man who stepped in because a rich donor made a phone call. He looked at Gregory Ashford. Your son tormented a 17-year-old girl because he was sure nobody would stop him. He was sure of that because you taught him money makes consequences disappear. He looked at the board. I'm not asking you to take my side. I'm asking you to watch the footage, read the emails, and then do the thing you already know needs doing. He sat back down. There was one more page in Delphine Roux's folder, and she read it last, and quietly. For the record, the man this facility fired for mopping its floors spent 19 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon before he came to this country. 3 weeks ago, in your lobby, he restarted an 81-year-old man's heart. There's footage of that, too. Josephine Marsh looked down the table at the man in the gray coverall in the last chair, and then she called a 15-minute recess. It ran 31. When the board came back, the vote was unanimous. Warren Pruitt was removed from his position, effective immediately. His fob was collected on the spot, and he left without a word, carrying only his phone and the framed photo of himself with the mayor. Tanner Ashford was banned from the complex permanently. Gregory Ashford's advisory seat was suspended, pending a formal review. Then Josephine Marsh turned toward the back of the room. Mr. Adeyemi? Solomon looked up. He hadn't moved the whole meeting. His hands were flat on his knees. His good shirt was still sharp from the 5 o'clock iron. Would you stand up, please? He stood slowly. Gideon turned in his chair to face him. Everybody in this room needs to see what a real father looks like. The board members rose, one after another, then the lawyers, then Josephine Marsh. Gregory Ashford stayed in his seat, staring at the grain of the table, and Solomon Adeyemi stood in the back row of a room he had never once been allowed to enter, in a shirt he'd pressed for a warehouse interview. And for the first time in 4 years in that building, every person in it was looking at him. Not through him. At him. His eyes burned. He pressed his lips together and nodded once, and that was enough. A month later, Solomon walked in through the front doors again, and the new fob clipped to his shirt read Facilities Lead. They gave him a small office by the mechanical room. with a window that actually opened and a brass nameplate that Josephine Marsh had ordered herself. His first act in the job was to fix the light standard in the far corner of the lot. 40 minutes and a $9 bulb, and then he had the crew relamp the outdoor rink pad, dark for 2 winters, so the neighborhood kids could skate under the lights again after supper. Ada noticed the fob before he'd even set down his keys. "Dad, it says lead. Does that mean you're the boss?" "It means I keep things running, so you're the boss of the mops." "Yeah, Ada, I'm the boss of the mops." She laughed so hard she nearly fell off the chair. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Gideon called and asked Solomon to meet him at a diner out on the highway. Cracked vinyl booths, bottomless coffee, a waitress who called everybody on. They sat 2 hours. Gideon told him about the Colleen Cormier Fund, about the kids it put on the ice, and how he'd never told Willa because he didn't want her thinking he was papering over grief with money. Then he slid an envelope across the table. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a letter. A full season of hockey for Ada Adiemi. Registration, equipment, tournament fees, all of it, plus a spot at the spring skills camp. Solomon read it 3 times. His hands were steady. His eyes were not. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," Gideon said. "That's why I did it." They shook hands. Gideon's grip was rough and firm, and held on a second longer than it needed to, and that second said everything neither of them was ever going to say out loud. Every Saturday after that, same diner, same booth. Gideon talked about engines and salvage. Solomon talked about Ada's first practice, how she fell 11 times and got up 11 times, how she cried in the truck on the way home and then asked when the next one was. Willa set up a small folding table by the front doors of the complex with a hand-lettered sign. Pencil portraits, $10. She still wore the hood most days, but it stayed down now. Ada was her first customer. She drew her for free, braids, wide eyes, the gap where the tooth used to be. Ada held it up and announced it was even better than the first one, and Willa smiled, a real one, the kind that stays. Gideon had a line he used at the yard whenever somebody questioned why he hired the men nobody else would touch. He said it once to Solomon over Saturday coffee, and Solomon never forgot it. "You don't judge a man by the coat he wears. You judge him by who he stops for." Solomon still works at the Amberley complex. He parks under the light he fixed himself, walks in through the front doors, and starts each morning the same way, with one word on the whiteboard at home and a hot chocolate left on the corner table by the vending machines, even though the girl who used to sit there has her own table by the door now. Ada made the U11 girls team in the fall. The first time she scored, Solomon was leaning on the glass, and he didn't cheer. He just stood there with his hand flat against the cold pane until the whistle blew. Her word notebook holds 231 entries. She keeps everyone. Willa got into the fine arts program at the college in Sudbury on the strength of a portfolio full of chickadees and salvage yards and a 9-year-old with braids. And she called Solomon before she called her father. Warren Pruitt's name became a thing hiring managers found and didn't ask about. Tanner Ashford finished his last year at a school 2 towns over, and nobody at Fort Amberley brought him up again. 2 fathers, 2 daughters, 1 paper cup, and 1 quiet decision that some strangers are worth the whole thing. So here's the question, and it's an honest one. If you'd been the one holding the mop that day, watching from across the floor with rent due and a kid at home and everything to lose, would you have set it down and walked over? Or would you have kept your eyes on the floor and told yourself it wasn't your business? Tell me down in the comments. Share this with the single parent in your life who's never once been told they're enough. And if a story like this stayed with you, follow along. Because kindness has never once asked what you ride or where you come from.